A silent night, a deserted road, and suddenly death looms over the man God had just chosen to liberate an entire nation. Have you ever stopped to think that Moses, the liberator of Israel, almost didn't reach Egypt? That the story you know almost ended before it even began? On that critical night, it wasn't an angel who saved Moses. It wasn't a visible miracle. It was Zipporah, his wife, who made an extreme, painful, and courageous decision. A woman the Bible mentions briefly, but whose actions changed the fate of millions. This is the story of Zipporah in the Bible, the woman who saved Moses at the most critical moment of his life. You will discover what really happened that night, why God confronted his own chosen one, and how a woman outside the center of the narrative became the key to the liberation from Egypt. And at the end of this video, I will reveal something that few realize, what this story teaches about obedience, faith, and the kind of courage God uses to save destinies. Get ready, because this exciting Bible story will show you that sometimes the strong women of the Bible act precisely when everyone else hesitates. The road was quiet. Moses was traveling with his family toward Egypt, carrying in his hands the most important mission a man had ever received, to liberate God's people from slavery. He had seen the burning bush. He had heard the voice of the Most High. He had received signs and authority. Everything seemed right. Everything seemed aligned. But then something unexpected happens. The biblical text in Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 to 26, records one of the most disturbing episodes in all of Scripture. It happened on the way, at an inn, that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Read that again. God wanted to kill Moses. The very God who had called him now rises up against him. There are no thunderclaps. There are no visible plagues. But the divine presence that brings death is there. And Moses has nowhere to run. Zipporah understands. She sees her husband between life and death. There is no time for explanations. There is no time for theological debates. There is only a critical moment, an impossible decision, and a woman who needs to act before it's too late. What led the chosen liberator to this point? What did Moses fail to do that provoked divine wrath precisely when he most needed protection? And what could a Midianite wife from outside the people of Israel do to reverse a death sentence decreed by God himself? Days earlier, Moses stood before the burning bush that was not consumed. There, barefoot on holy ground, he received the most extraordinary calling in history. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out, and I have come down to set them free. Now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh. Imagine the scene. An 80-year-old man, exiled in the desert for 4 decades, receives the mission to confront the most powerful empire in the world. Moses questioned. He hesitated. He asked for signs. And God gave him everything. The staff that turned into a snake, the hand that became leprous and was healed, the promise that he would be with him. Even Aaron was appointed to help him speak. Everything was prepared, but there was something Moses neglected, a divine command given to Abraham centuries earlier, a physical mark of covenant that separated God's people from all other nations: circumcision. Moses, who had grown up in the Egyptian palace and lived 40 years in Midian, had not circumcised his own son. Why? Perhaps due to cultural influence, perhaps due to complacency, or perhaps because, even though he was called, he still carried unresolved areas of disobedience. And here is a truth that the Bible, when explained, makes clear. Being called does not mean total approval. God can choose someone and still demand changes. He can use one man to liberate millions, but he will not tolerate that man ignoring the principles of the covenant. God's holiness is non-negotiable, and what seemed to be a detail was about to become a matter of life or death. Moses had the mission. He had the authority. But there was a hidden flaw, and God would not allow him to move forward without correcting it. Faith and obedience in the Old Testament were not optional. They were the foundation of everything. Zipporah was not an Israelite. She was the daughter of Jethro, priest of Midian, a region far from the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When Moses fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian, it was in the desert of Midian that he found refuge. And it was there, defending Jethro's daughters at the well, that he met the woman who would become his wife. The Bible doesn't dedicate many verses to Zipporah. We know she married Moses. We know they had children. We know she was by his side when God called him back to Egypt. But her voice is rarely heard. Her actions are briefly mentioned. In the eyes of many readers, she is merely the wife of the great liberator, a female character in the Bible in the background. But God doesn't work with a plan. He doesn't place people in places by chance. And on that terrifying night on the road to Egypt, it would become clear that Zipporah wasn't just a supporting character. She was a woman chosen for a specific moment, for a decisive action, for an act that no one else could perform. Think about it. While Moses carried the public mission of liberating a nation, Zipporah carried something equally crucial, the ability to act when obedience was urgent. And perhaps that is precisely why God allowed her to be there, not to be forgotten, but to save the fate of Israel even before the liberation began. Zipporah in the Bible is more than just Moses' wife. She is proof that God uses unexpected people in the most critical moments. Moses left Midian with his family. He carried with him God's staff, the instructions he had received, and the promise that the Lord would be with him. Egypt lay ahead. Pharaoh would be confronted. The people would be freed. Everything seemed to be in order. But during the journey, as they crossed the desert toward the land of slavery, something began to weigh on them. It wasn't just the weariness of the road. It wasn't the fear of what was to come. It was something deeper, an unresolved spiritual error, an incomplete obedience that, in the face of God's holiness, could not be ignored. Circumcision was the physical mark of the covenant between God and the people of Abraham. God had clearly stated in Genesis 17, "This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Any uncircumcised male shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." Moses knew this, but his son had not been circumcised, and now he was on his way to Egypt to represent the God of the covenant before Pharaoh. How could he demand that Pharaoh obey God if he himself was not obeying? How could he lead a people back to the covenant if within his own house the covenant was broken? The mission was too great to be carried on a basis of disobedience. And before another day dawned, before another step was taken toward Egypt, God decided to act. The complete biblical story shows that he does not tolerate inconsistency in those who bear his name. And what seemed to be just a journey was about to become the most terrifying episode of Moses' life. Oh, and if you've been following along this far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because this story is only beginning to reveal its true power. And it came to pass on the way, at an inn, that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Exodus 4:24. Read it again. Let that sink in. The God who called Moses now wants to kill him. There is no transition. There is no long warning. Just the divine presence, now lethal, upon the man who was to liberate Israel. This was not a symbolic test. Moses was truly on the verge of death. Some scholars believe he was struck by a sudden and serious illness. Others suggest that God's presence brought a kind of immediate physical judgment. The text doesn't detail how, but it makes clear what. God was executing judgment, and the reason was the broken covenant. Consider the gravity of this. Moses was no ordinary man. He was no stranger to faith. He had witnessed miracles. He had spoken face to face with God, and yet God made no exception. Divine holiness is non-negotiable. Partial obedience is complete disobedience. And when God establishes a covenant, it is not optional, even for those he chooses for great missions. Moses was incapacitated. He might not even be able to speak. Death was near. And there, in that inn in the middle of the desert, the fate of Israel hung by a thread. If Moses died there, all would be lost. There would be no liberation. There would be no exodus. There would be no 10 plagues, no crossing of the Red Sea or giving of the law at Sinai. But God, in his sovereignty, was not merely bringing judgment. He was offering a solution. And the person who would see this, who would understand what needed to be done, was not Moses. It was Zipporah. Zipporah did not hesitate. While death hung over Moses, she acted. She took a sharp stone, there was no time to find a metal blade, and circumcised her own son right there. The act was quick, extreme, and painful. There was no ceremony, no preparation, just urgent obedience. And then, the text records something striking. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone, cut off her son's foreskin, and threw it at Moses' feet, saying, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." Exodus 4:25. She didn't just obey, she declared something profound. She recognized that blood, the blood of the covenant, was the price of protection. It was what separated life from death. That was not a moment of aesthetic beauty, it was a moment of brutal faith. Zipporah took upon herself the responsibility that Moses had neglected. She did what needed to be done, even if it was difficult, even if it was uncomfortable, even if she, as a Midianite, might not fully understand all the theological aspects of that covenant. She acted. And in acting, she saved not only her husband, but the fate of an entire nation. The following verse confirms this. Then the Lord left him. The threat ceased. Death receded. God withdrew, not in abandonment, but in satisfaction. The covenant had been honored, obedience had been restored, and Moses could continue his journey. Zipporah saved Moses. That is the stark and powerful truth of the circumcision episode in the Bible. A woman who saved Moses, not with inspiring words, but with decisive action, at the exact moment when inaction would have meant death. She is, without a doubt, one of the strong women of the Bible who changed the course of history. After that act, the Bible records no applause. There are no angels singing. There is no public recognition. There is only silence. God withdraws. Moses recovers. The family continues their journey. And Zipporah, who had just saved the liberator of Israel, returns to the background of the narrative. Does this bother you? It should, because it reveals something about how God works. He doesn't need spotlights to validate obedience. He doesn't demand that every heroic action be celebrated publicly. Sometimes the greatest acts of faith happen in hidden places, in moments of crisis, far from the eyes of the world. And God sees, He honors, He uses. Zipporah was used by God precisely because she was willing to act when no one else could. She had no prophetic title. She wasn't a priestess. She wasn't a leader. She was a wife and mother, far from her homeland, married to a man who carried an impossible mission. And when the time came, she did what needed to be done. This is what it means to be a woman used by God in the Bible. It's not about visibility. It's about availability. It's not about fame. It's about faithfulness. And Zipporah on that terrible night was faithful in a way that few would dare to be. Deliverance in the Bible doesn't always come in spectacular ways. Sometimes it comes through ordinary hands doing extraordinary things. And that night, Zipporah's hands grasped a sharp stone and saved the future of millions. If you ask 10 people about Moses, they will all remember the 10 plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea, the 10 commandments. But ask them about Zipporah. Ask them about the night she saved his life. Most won't know the answer. Why? Why has this story been forgotten? Why do the forgotten stories of the Bible include so many women who changed biblical history? Zipporah is not the only one. There is Miriam, Moses' sister, who led the people in worship after the Red Sea. There is Deborah, who judged Israel. There is Esther, who saved her people from annihilation. There are women whose actions were decisive, but whose names are rarely celebrated. Perhaps because for centuries, storytellers have preferred to focus on male heroes, perhaps because acts of silent obedience don't generate the same epic narrative as public battles and miracles, or perhaps because, as a society, we've learned to underestimate the power of actions done in private, away from the stage and the crowds. But the Bible doesn't hide these stories, it records them. And the fact that they are there, even briefly, is an invitation for us to discover them, study them, and honor them, because God does not forget. And if He chose to preserve Zipporah's story in the Scriptures, it's because there is something He wants us to learn. The strong women of the Bible don't need our permission to be strong. They already were. And it's up to us to recognize and learn from their courage, their faith, and their radical obedience. After that night, Moses moved on. He arrived in Egypt. He confronted Pharaoh. He witnessed the plagues. He led the people through the Red Sea. He received the law at Sinai. He led Israel through the desert for 40 years. His story is one of the most epic in all of Scripture, but none of this would have happened if Zipporah hadn't acted at that inn. Moses and Zipporah are connected in a way that few realize, not just as husband and wife, but as partners in obedience. He carried the public mission. She executed the private obedience that made the mission possible. Think about it. The entire liberation of Israel depended on one moment, a single moment of corrected disobedience. And the person who corrected it wasn't Moses. It was his wife. The entire biblical story shows that God often uses unexpected people to ensure His plans are fulfilled. And Zipporah is living proof, or rather, biblical proof, of that. Obedience to God in the Bible isn't about greatness. It's about doing what's right at the right time, regardless of who's watching. It's about honoring the covenant, even when it's difficult. And it's about being available to be used by God, even if it means making extreme decisions. Moses continued because someone obeyed, and Israel was freed because, before the plagues and miracles, there was a woman who held a sharp stone and refused to let God's covenant be broken. So, what do we learn from Zipporah? That faith is not just belief. Faith is action. It is the courage to do what needs to be done when everyone else hesitates. It is the willingness to obey even when the path is difficult, painful, and misunderstood. Zipporah didn't have time for theological debates. She didn't have time to seek consensus. She saw the need, understood the solution, and acted. And her action not only saved Moses, it allowed God's promise to be fulfilled. The teachings of the Bible show us that swift obedience saves lives. Hesitation can cost destinies. How many times is God waiting for someone to act? How many times is a promise held back because someone doesn't want to do the hard part? How many times does God's plan depend on an ordinary person who chooses to obey instead of questioning? Zipporah's story reminds us that God doesn't seek perfection. He seeks availability. He doesn't seek celebrities. He seeks faithful people. And when those people act, worlds change, nations are freed, destinies are redeemed. You may not be called to liberate a nation, but you may be called to a moment of radical obedience that changes everything. And when that moment comes, the question is, will you act like Zipporah, or will you hesitate? Faith and obedience in the Old Testament and throughout Scripture go hand in hand. And the woman who saved Moses teaches us that sometimes the greatest demonstration of faith is not in the words we say, but in the actions we take when no one else is watching. Zipporah's story isn't just about a courageous woman, it's about you. It's about me. It's about all of us who at some point will be called to act in obedience when everything around us is at stake. It's about understanding that God doesn't compromise His holiness, but offers us all the chance to participate in His plans if we are willing to obey. Zipporah saved Moses, and in saving him, she saved Israel. In saving Israel, she participated in the history that would lead to the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who would bring salvation not only to one nation, but to all of humanity. It all began with a sharp stone, a difficult decision. and a woman who refused to let God's covenant be broken. So here's my question for you. What is God asking you to do today? What area of obedience have you been neglecting? What difficult decision have you been putting off? Because, as Zipporah taught us, there are times when hesitation can cost you everything. If this moving Bible story touched you, leave your comment below. Tell me, what impacted you most in Zipporah's story in the Bible? And if you haven't already subscribed, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because we continue exploring the strong women of the Bible and the forgotten stories that transform lives. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that faith is action, that obedience saves destinies, and that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. May you have the courage of Zipporah. May your faith be accompanied by action. And may you, in the critical moment, be the person God uses to change everything. Until the next video. And remember, true faith acts when everyone else hesitates.